Okay, welcome, Croeso, to the 2026 Scotland and Wales election analysis. And it's a joint podcast by us at the Wales Governance Centre at Cardiff University and the Fraser of Allander Institute at the University of Strathclyde. My name's Ed Poole, and I'm a reader in political science down at Cardiff University. And I'm joined today by my colleagues from the Fraser of Allander Institute, Ciara Crummey and João Sousa. Hello, guys.
Hiya.
Hi.
So as we've been going through the various different podcasts, the last podcast we were recorded and released was about Wales and the future funding outlook there. So I wanted to take a deeper dive on the situation up in Scotland, looking at the funding outlook and some of the areas where policy decisions have been really quite different, and particularly over areas like income tax and on public sector pay. There's been quite big divergences between Scotland and the rest of the UK. How has funding differed over the past parliamentary term compared with how the parties thought it might shape out at the time of the last election?
Much like what we talked about for the Welsh government's funding, this has also been a parliamentary term of quite a lot of roller coaster of funding. You know, we were in the throes of the pandemic when the last election was held. We didn't know how long we were going to need particular spending on COVID to last for. And then by not even a year after that, we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which obviously precipitated a period of high energy prices and high inflation. That kind of eroded a lot of the spending power that the Scottish government had. I think, if anything, when we look at real term spending power, on capital in particular, there's a lot of this that is underplayed by just looking at, we'll usually use the GDP deflator to get real terms data, but actually the cost of delivering some capital projects has shot up much more than the headline figures would let us believe. So that's really been a key difficulty for the Scottish government, but also on the day-to-day side, of course. There's been plenty of top-ups from the UK government throughout, but not on a consistent basis and a quite, I would say, at times haphazard timings. And the Scottish government has had quite a lot of difficulty in managing its budget, largely because it has had a very difficult set of circumstances to contend with, but it's also kind of at times not helped itself by, for example, not setting a pay policy beforehand. And when it has set a pay policy, it hasn't exactly stuck to it, as I'm sure we'll come to talking about. You know, if you don't know what your budget is going to be, and there's the potential that you're not going to get as much in terms of consequentials as you might have thought, for example, then perhaps it would be more prudent to not fully allocate everything and just live hand to mouth. That's not what the Scottish government has done. I mean, there's always a political imperative to try and allocate as much as you can. And that has meant that we've had, I think, two or three emergency financial statements throughout this parliament. It almost feels like we couldn't go for a while without one being put in place. The Scottish government actually had to pause all non-essential spending in one of the years in 24-25. Before then, there was the big first Rachel Reeves budget, which increased spending significantly, which made things a little easier to deal with. And ultimately, the Scottish government has actually increased underlying spending quite significantly in the past parliament, not just on public sector pay, which I mentioned before, but also on social security, over which there's quite a few powers, and Scottish spending broadly exceeds the block grant adjustments that come from the UK government for it. But there's also been quite a bit of additional spending on things like, you know, nationalising ScotRail, for example, which means that the Scottish government has actually been running what we call an underlying deficit. That means that when you strip away reconciliations, which come from wrong forecasts about how much might have been raised by income tax, when you strip away things like borrowing or use of the Crown Estate revenues, so that's licenses that have been issued for offshore wind. There's revenue that comes from that, but that's kind of finite revenue because you can only issue, you know, a certain amount of licenses and they last for a while. Once you account for that, there's about I mean, it varies year by year, but there's at least £500 million in an underlying deficit that's every year being kind of just put into the black by using those non-recurring revenues. And that's something that is not sustainable over the long term, because if those don't materialize, or if there's a negative reconciliation, so if it turns out we've raised less revenue than we thought we would, which seems like it might be the case in a couple of years' time, then it could be a much more difficult situation.
Interesting stuff. I presume that the parties are going to be having to deal with the consequences of that as they're planning out their manifestos, or maybe just rather prefer not to talk about it. What do you think?
Oh, I'm sure they would prefer not to talk about it, but it seems inevitable that some of it will have to be discussed. So one thing that's already happened. So we have a medium-term financial strategy that comes out. It's supposed to come out every year. It tells us how much the Scottish Government is planning to spend over the coming 5 years and how much it thinks it will have in funding. There was a big gap both on day-to-day and on the capital side. On capital, that kind of the reckoning has happened because the Scottish Government has kind of molded its plans to the much lower levels of spending that is now recognizing it will have. But on the day-to-day side, that's not really happened yet. So the reckoning has kind of been deferred. Again, consequentials that come, for example, the special educational needs and disabilities additional funding, that will help the Scottish Government in the coming year. But again, that's not a sustainable way of running this. It just looks like, just shifting money around to make sure that everything gets financed, but not really reckoning with that yet. There's been lots of assumptions on efficiencies, both by the Scottish Government and by opposition parties, which look, I wouldn't say fanciful, but incredibly optimistic.
Yeah. So I also want to talk, because one of the areas that has been really well noted outside of Scotland is the Scottish Government's use of income tax powers, and that is where they've created more bands and raised taxes on the higher level earners, a little lower on lower level earners, in comparison with elsewhere in the UK, and particularly in Wales, where the Welsh Government has not as extensive powers, but it does have powers over income tax and hasn't used them at all. So I wonder if you could give us a flavour of what's been going on in that space, Ciara.
Yeah, sure. So despite actually promising in their manifesto that they weren't they were going to freeze income tax rates and bans, Scottish Government actually have introduced quite a lot of changes and used a lot of those powers that you've just spoken about there. The main one being they introduced the advanced rate tax in April 2024. So that was taxing incomes between 75,000 and 125,000, about 45%, which was quite a big change in introducing a sixth tax band compared to the 3 in the rest of the UK. In addition to this, over the Parliament, they've also increased the higher rate tax band from 41% to 42% and increased the top rate band from 46% to 47%. And within that, also decreased the threshold that the top rate tax is initially introduced down to 125,000 from 150,000. They have also made some changes, as you said, at the lower income bands, and they've increased those above inflation in recent budgets. So basically, the culmination of all of that means that those at lower incomes are paying less tax than the rest of the UK. And this is mostly driven by the starter rate, which starts at 19% compared to 20% of the basic rate in the UK system. Then at the other end of the income stream, anyone earning above £30,000, they then pay more tax than you would do in the rest of the UK if you were on a similar salary.
So I suppose the overall effect then is that receipts from taxes are higher than they would have been if no impact had been, or no changes had been made to the rate. What's the reason for that? Is it that the block grant has been cut more rapidly than would otherwise have been expected, or is it to try and offset some of the kind of the harder edge choices associated with cutting budgets? What's been the main reasons that this has been going on?
So in some sense, the Scottish Government, because the system is quite different from the Welsh system. There's only one block grant adjustment, whereas in Wales there are 3. And that means that the properties that make it actually quite hard for the Scottish Government to maintain the net position, which is the difference between how much it raises and how much the block grant gets deducted by. It makes it quite hard for them to do that without changing tax rates. The reason being that, particularly in London and in the southeast, there's so many more additional right taxpayers that actually, even if incomes were growing at the same rate, you'd always be getting more revenue from those additional rate taxpayers. Mm-hmm. And that means that essentially the Scottish government has to run to stay still, which is not a particularly comfortable position. So they've done this in a multitude of ways. As Ciara said, they've cut taxes on lower earners, but that's actually quite an expensive policy for not very much benefit for those having those lower tax rates, because it's not even £1 a week.
Right. Okay.
So it's very small, but obviously that affects everyone, because everyone above that level of income gets that lower rate for that particular bit of their income because of the structure. So that's quite expensive. So how do they pay for that? They pay for that on top of trying to combat the fast increase in the block grant adjustment by having a higher rate threshold. So that was increased in 2019 from 43,000 roughly to 50,000 by then Chancellor Philip Hammond. That didn't happen in Scotland. So the higher rate kicks in at £43,500. And then you have the fact that the rates are slightly higher in Scotland, which raises a bit of revenue as well. So those are the ways in which they've tried to kind of combat that. So the Scottish income tax system raises about £1 billion more than you would in the absence of changes in rates. So it's not an insignificant amount of money.
And I suppose the implications of what you're saying in terms of the differentiation between high earning taxpayers in the southeast of England and London versus the rest of the UK, the implication would be that it'd be hard for any government to not follow suit, perhaps in keeping pressure up on tax rates, or potentially having to make cuts elsewhere.
Yeah, that's right. So the Scottish government, much like the Welsh government, cannot run a deficit, and that means that essentially, if you want to spend, keep spending growing relative to previous years, then you're going to have to raise taxes to some extent. Of course, that is a political choice, right? Like, you don't have to have spending growing quite as strongly. You could decide to let people have more money in their pockets and spend it themselves. But then that is ultimately the political preferences that are being put to the test at election time. Is, do we think that spending more on public services or less should be the priority? And I think the consensus from the votes at recent Scottish elections has been to kind of put more into public services. But there is now a situation where there is a gap that's growing in between what the Scottish government wants to spend on and the funding that is likely to have available. And I don't think it's realistic to fully fill that by tax increases. So that means that spending has to be under the microscope now.
Yeah, and I suppose that's part of what we're doing, and part of what elections, that's what elections are for. I suppose at the end of the day, for people to scrutinise government plans before they're put into action, they're being offered to the voters. Just actually thinking about the choices and the budget that is being made, another area that's been huge differences between Scotland and the rest of the UK has been about public sector pay. And your report goes into a lot of detail about this in terms of how some of the different approaches in Scotland, where, as far as I understand it, collective bargaining is used, whereas in the rest of the UK, kind of pay review board decisions are adopted for pay growth. How has this had an impact on the budget, and what can we expect going forward?
So public sector pay policies have been as João mentioned earlier, it's been in the news a lot over the last couple of years here, and it has affected the budgets of the last couple of years. And the main thing behind this is that since 2002, the Scottish Government haven't actually been able to follow any of the pay deal policies that they have set. So they set the pay deal policy and work out that money within the budget for what they're going to need for the year. And then when it comes to these the pay deals have been set above the policy, so then it's costing more money throughout the year. So, for example, there was a 3% pay deal agreed in 23-24, and the average public sector pay award that was awarded that year was 6.5%. So you can see if you've budgeted for 3% and you're paying out 6.5%, that money's going to have to come from somewhere else. And this has been a trend that's happened every year since 2022, that they haven't been following the public sector pay deals. In the most recent year, they currently have a 3-year pay policy set, which is set at 3% per year or 9% over the 3 years. And this also hasn't really been followed. They've been setting deals above 3% for the last 2 years. And the culmination of this is basically the pay deals this year need to be around 1% of nominal growth. Otherwise, that also isn't going to be set this year. And this is something that wasn't really addressed in the January budget this year. So it's something that the incoming government are going to have to deal with if they are going to be awarding pay deals, which is likely to be above this 1%. That's something that isn't going to be budgeted in for the new government when they come in.
This is all on top of the fact that some of the Barnett consequentials that came from during the pandemic, they were for one-off pay deals, that wouldn't be consolidated in England, but they have been consolidated in Scotland, which is obviously it's great for the people who are receiving those awards, because that bumps up their pay forever essentially. But that means that you have a mismatch between the funding that came with it and what you're spending and what you're committing yourself to spending in future. So Ciara's just mentioned the 1% that's basically implied by this. I think no one would think that is a reasonable level at which these pay deals might settle. I mean, it wasn't before the Iran war broke out. It certainly isn't now. So what's going to give here? The Scottish government, as I said, cannot run a deficit. I think absent obviously there was a big increase in funding, nearly 600 million from the education budget in England, and Barnett consequences for that. That's going to make things easier in 26, 27, and might even be enough with a few minor efficiencies on the other side of the ledger to make things add up. But is that really solving the issue? I would say it isn't, because if we don't address the fact that this is going to happen again in 27, 28, and 28, 29, we're not really contending with the fact that there is a gap in between what the Scottish government says it wants to spend and how much it's likely to have to spend. And ultimately, at some point, there is going to be a negative. I mean, that the Scottish government has been buffeted by many things, but one of the things that has happened is it has had consecutive years of these one-off sources of funding, which make it seem like it's fine because we've been managing. But it's like the old story of like it happens slowly and then all at once. If there is a year in which that doesn't happen, then what's the answer? And I think we were close to something pretty bad in 24-25 before the big UK budget, because the Scottish government was essentially cutting anything that it could cut back on halfway through the year. That could happen again. And that does not seem like a sensible way of running a government.
I mean, I suppose it gets into the broader problem of the way that the devolved governments are funded, in the sense that there's this great uncertainty about the future shape of what they're going to have to spend. And all chancellors of both colours over recent years have front-loaded increases in spending, which are then kind of penciled in to be affordable by having much tighter increases in the out years. And I suppose this is creating a whole, like, one of the ripple effects of that is creating a kind of hand-to-mouth kind of response from the devolved governments, in which they're not particularly well able to plan in the future, because they're using forecasts that are likely to not be true, in the sense that they're likely to be topped up. But I suppose it's a high risk game, because if it doesn't,
it's a game of chicken, isn't it? It creates really perverse incentives as well, because the question is, if that came to pass, like, who would cover things? And there is not even a provision for anything like this. So accounting officers have to issue a Section 114 notice if a local council doesn't look like it can balance its budget. But what happens if a devolved government can't balance its budget? You know, and in all the situations, you know, there is always, there's never one reason for why these things happen. There's a multitude of reasons, but ultimately, you know, as a devolved administration, it is the Scottish government's responsibility to balance its budget. So it's not a particularly comfortable position to be in, and it gives us no pleasure talking about this. You know, like it's we don't want to be scaremongering, but on the other hand, you know, the sums as they are presented at the moment, they don't add up. So it is important for us to say this. And so one of the things that the main messages of our report is we need to be honest with the voters, because if this happens in a couple of years' time, then this is the point at which we have to make decisions about what might happen.
Yeah, and those are not comfortable questions for politicians running for re-election or for election for the first time. They're difficult topics for political parties to have to deal with. But as you say, these are important ones to get to grips with. We're going to come on to loads more topics, and your report goes into a lot of detail about social security powers and childcare spending and FE and HE and health. We're going to cover all of those in subsequent episodes, but I think that's probably brought us up to a good place to pause for this current discussion. But thanks ever so much for you guys listening, and to Ciara and to João, and thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thank you.